All right, let's jump into our wide receivers here. Jauan Jennings is our first one. He's got a tough Bears secondary. Back-to-back games here, Matthew, with single-digit fantasy points as the Niners have really, really struggled all over the place.
Yeah, I'm still keeping it open. I think Jauan Jennings is good, right? I mean, I'm at wide receiver 24. It was one of those things where every single game, in the 4 games since he returned from injury, right, he has either led the team in targets or tied for the team in targets as well, right? Listen, you think about the last 2 games, and they're just sort of fluky, honestly. Last week, of course, the crazy snow game in Buffalo, McCaffrey gets hurt, sort of throws their entire offense off, and Buffalo came ready to play. The week before that, it was Brandon Allen. So, under center for the 49ers against the Packers. So I don't know that we have a really great sense of what this 49ers offense is based on the last 2 weeks, because they were just sort of fluky games. This week, I think, against the Bears will be a much more normal game. And by the way, a desperate must-win for the 49ers to keep their playoff hopes alive. Again, 32% target share in the 4 games since returning from injury. Over the last 4 weeks, Bears allow the 6th highest catch rate to wide receivers, over 70%. And so Jennings, who I just think is talented, Connor. I don't think because Ayuk and Debo were higher draft picks, they have – this is a weird thing. We've talked about this a little bit on the show. I'm just going to go on a quick tangent here. But I'm a big believer, especially when it comes to professional athletes, that for some reason, sometimes players, if they don't have a weird name or a unique name or a cool name, they just sort of just get, you know what I mean? Like Debo Samuel, like that's an awesome name, right? Like Brandon Ayuk, that's a unique name, right? Jauan Jennings is just like, whatever. Jauan Jennings is like, a guy that had 1 hit in the 80s or something like that. But, I just feel like Jauan Jennings doesn't get his due. I don't think this is just a volume play. I feel like the perception of Jauan Jennings is, he's just a guy and he happens to be out there and he's getting targets because he's out there. And my argument, I feel free to agree or disagree. My argument is that Jauan Jennings is actually a really good player. And that I think there's a chance the Niners move on from Debo Samuel after this season. And one of the reasons is because the confidence they have in Jauan Jennings. They also drafted Ricky Pearsall, of course. But I don't know. I think Jennings can absolutely play, and I'm keeping it open for him this week for sure.
Yeah, I'm with you all the way. I think the Niners next year will move on from Debo because of that contract unless they find a way to rework things, and Jennings just slides into that number 2 role, right? Especially you're going to have Brandon Ayuk coming off a season-ending injury. That rehab is going to take a while. They drafted Ricky Pearsall at the end of the first round, but we'll see how they use him. I do agree, Matthew. He's really, really talented, and Lawrence, he might even, be needed more than ever this week because he talked about it with the running backs. The bye weeks for wide receivers is terrible this week.
Yeah, if there's a lot of running backs out, you best believe it's more receivers out, right? Because there's more of them on the field. But look, I'm not even mad at the fact that he had 3 catches for 56 yards in the snow,
right, a blizzard,
and the offense looked bad. He played 96% of the snaps to Debo's 75. That was the next best receiver. So, yeah, I'm not – and, look, you got the Bears, too. Now, the Bears' defense is solid, but 2 of their last 3 games, they've allowed 150 yards to wide receivers, and those 2 guys is Jordan Addison and Christian Watson. I will put Jauan Jennings up against them 2 guys any day.
Speaking of that snow game, Amari Cooper, he's got the Rams this week, 7.4 points per game in the 4 games since joining the Bills, Lawrence. It feels like a really slow ramp up for him in Buffalo. Now, you mentioned the weird weather game last week. That plays a little bit into it. But he hasn't been thrusted into this wide receiver 1 pass game funnel role that some people expected.
Yeah, it's crazy that his best game with the Bills was his first one. You see it there, catching 4 passes on 5 targets for 66 and a touchdown. But his last 2 games, he's averaged 3 targets, 2.5 catches, and only 33 yards per game. He's played no more than 51% of the snaps since he's been a Buffalo Bills. Khalil Shakir is still Josh Allen's most trusted target. I think that goes without saying. So gonna have to close it out this week for Amari Cooper because it just seems that it's not that it seems. He's way far off from being that wide receiver 1 from the Bills. And quite frankly, they don't even need him to be that right now.
Matthew, another thing we'll keep an eye on going into this game is if Keon Coleman with that wrist injury finally returns, and same for Dalton Kincaid. He can finally be back. I'm sure that would factor even more into the decision to sit Amari Cooper if that's the route you go.
I'm closing it out. He's my wide receiver 38 this week. Even if you knew, here's what I say: whether Kincaid plays, whether Coleman plays, whatever. The fact of the matter is, let's pretend those two things happen. Let's pretend Kincaid doesn't play and Coleman is out, and you know both those things. You're still like, where's he going with Josh? Like, is he throwing it to Amari Cooper? Is he throwing it to Dawson Knox? Is he throwing it to Khalil Shakir? Is he throwing it to himself? Like, you know, like there's just so many different ways that the Bills can score. They spread it around. That's part of their. That's not a flaw. It's a design, right? You know what I mean? The fact of the matter is that is how the Bills are winning this year, is by getting everyone involved and not focusing on any one player. Since Amari Cooper joined the Buffalo Bills, and I understand he's been banged up, but since he joined the Buffalo Bills, he's got an 11% target share. He's got a 53% route participation. That is a part-time player. 3 or fewer targets in each of the past 3 games that he's been active with the Bills. So I'm closing it out on Amari Cooper. And maybe the narrative's on him a little bit different if he doesn't pitch that ball back to Josh, if he turned and ran that ball in somehow. But he pitches it back to Josh. Josh scores a receiving touchdown on a pass that he threw. Amazing day in fantasy and in NFL. But, yeah, for Amari Cooper, I think better days are ahead, especially if you have him in a dynasty league. But closing him out, and can't imagine counting on him at any point until we see consistent production from him and the Bills.
Our last receiver here, Matthew, Darnell Mooney. He's got a good matchup with the Vikings secondary, but as Kirk Cousins has completely plummeted, so has Darnell Mooney's production recently.
Yeah, he has, and it's frustrating. I will say I'm going to keep it open on Darnell Mooney, and there's a couple reasons why. Now, he's my wide receiver 32, so he's a low-end wide receiver 3, high-end wide receiver 4, so this is probably more for teams that play 3 when you're in a league that plays 3 wide receivers, or, again, a 12 or deeper team league, and you're really hurt by the wide receiver buys, as Lawrence mentioned, so many great names on bye this week as well. It's not as bad a matchup with the Vikings as you might think, right? 54% of Mooney's fantasy points this year have come on deep passes. They like to throw it deep to Darnell Mooney, not a shot. Well, the Vikings, actually, that's one area where they're vulnerable, right? They've allowed the 2nd most catches and 3rd most yards on deep passes. In the NFL, it sort of makes sense. They bring the house a lot. They like to blitz. And so when they're blitzing, they're leaving guys in single coverage. And if you can get the ball off, you can get to somebody deep as well. And so Darnell Mooney, I think, has a chance on the road at Minnesota, in the Dome, on the turf, in a game in which the Falcons, candidly, I think they lose this game, Lawrence. I think they'll be trailing. And I think I think game script will be on the positive side for Darnell Mooney, because obviously Bijan Robinson and Drake London are going to get a lot of attention from Brian Flores' defense.
We've mentioned how much Kirk Cousins has struggled and how much this offense has kind of hit a rut here. There's already been some chatter. Will we ever see Michael Penix this season? We got to hear from Raheem Morris on the state of the offense this week.
Was able to talk to him right away with the team, was able to talk to him right away alone time, one-on-one. Obviously, we had another team meeting today, was able to address everything. I'm not a big one-on-one guy. I'm kind of one of those guys that like to speak in masses, particularly when we talk about a team that we are and how close we are. You don't have to really hold things or sugarcoat what you're saying. I think our team gets it, along with our coaches. I'll talk with Kurt again probably today or tomorrow, but I think we've done a lot of talking when it comes to all those things. It's just really about just locking back in and really just trying to put everybody on the same page of where we're at still. You know, you're still 6-6, tied for the division, or half a lead, however you do that in the statistical world. But we got it. We still got the pen, and we still got to go write the story and what's going to happen.
Doesn't sound like a guy that plans to make a switch anytime soon.
Nah, it's not going to be a switch. And, I get it. They signed Kirk Cousins to the money, so, things would have to get way worse.
There's no going back once you make that move.
Right, like it's bad, but it ain't as worse as it could be. The positive, and it's like we talked about Kyle Pitts last week too. I don't think there's anybody right now you feel good starting in this offense in your fantasy lineup beside Bijan Robinson. He proved that going over 100 rushing yards. Even Drake London, you see the final stat was 9 receptions for 86 yards, but it took 16 targets to get 86, like little bitty 86 yards on 16 targets. But the positives here for Darnell Mooney, Matthew mentioned it, the Falcons being 5.5-point underdogs. Minnesota has allowed a receiving touchdown to a receiver in 3 straight games, and they've allowed the 3rd most receiving yards to receivers this season. So that's your positives for Darnell Mooney, and that's why we keeping it open slightly.
Right. Let's go to our tight end here. Go ahead, Matthew.
I was just going to say just about the Falcons in general. I sort of agree with you guys. I think the Falcons gonna lose on Sunday, and I think he's gonna look bad doing it. He's looked bad in every game where he wasn't playing the Buccaneers this year.
Yeah,
he really has. Kirk Cousins has. Now again, they've got a big contract, and Raheem Morris is kind of a veterans guy, so I think things would have to get pretty desperate for them to go to Penix. I will say this: that if they do it, this is what I'm telling you right now. I don't know if it's true or not. But if they decide to make that move, and I think the chatter will increase significantly if they lose to Minnesota and Cousins doesn't play well, Cousins will suddenly have an injury. And for people listening, I'm using air quotes. But all of a sudden, it'll be like, the Achilles is acting up or whatever. He's got a hamstring. He's got a hamstring strain. He's got a thigh, a thigh, a hip. I'm just telling you, suddenly they're not going to bench Kirk Cousins, but an injury may suddenly appear that's going to keep him out for multiple weeks. If they feel like they need to do this. I will say, you're obviously starting Bijan Robinson. This week specifically, I can't imagine you have a better option than Drake London. I agree with you. It's taken volume for him to get there. There's some warning signs about the offense overall. But, listen, he went 8 for 97 against New Orleans in Week 10. He scored the touchdown in Week 9 against Dallas. So, he's been getting there. You're starting Drake London. And like I said, I'm keeping it open on Darnell Mooney. I will say that Kyle Pitts and Kirk Cousins are not only not startable, they're droppable. If I saw Kyle Pitts in a league as a free agent, I'm not picking him up. He's been brutal. Cousins has been brutal. You need to have other options than those 2 guys. And that's not just for this week. That's just moving forward as we head into the fantasy playoffs. We haven't seen enough production where you're sort of like you would feel comfortable trusting them in, win or lose situations, win or go home kind of situations.
Hey, it's Matthew Berry from NBCSports.com and Rotoworld.com, and I want to thank you so much for watching whatever it is you just watched, or if nothing else, being too lazy to click out of the autoplay after this video started, after whatever it is you actually wanted to watch finished. But now that you're here, I'd like to take a moment here to ask you respectfully now, okay? I'm asking you respectfully to subscribe to the NFL on NBC YouTube channel. You'll get the latest Roto-World fantasy news headlines, all sorts of great shows, including my own Fantasy Football Happy Hour. So go subscribe now. Again, I'm asking respectfully.